and welcome. I'm Michelle Evander, editor of Reporting on Health. We're going to be learning today about Excel basics for analyzing health data, an introductory course that will help you to begin to interview the data, a skill that ultimately will allow you to test out hypotheses, understand trends, and better understand and report on your community. We're fortunate to be guided by Paul Overberg, a veteran data journalist who helped build USA Today into the data and data visualization powerhouse it is today. If you have two screens, you can watch Paul's work and try and follow along on your computer. But please keep in mind that we'll also record this webinar so you can return to the archived version on Reporting on Health to review. Paul has also helpfully provided a bunch of tip sheets on the webinar page that will allow you to continue to deepen your expertise after this webinar ends. We'll be following up on this webinar with another one on July 23rd, focused on data visualization and led by Becca Aronson, News App Editor at the Texas Tribune. You can sign up for that webinar on Reporting on Health as well. Paul is going to be working during this demo with the Centers for Disease Control table on the leading causes of death. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few operating procedures. We'll hear first from Paul, who will give a briefing of about 40 minutes. Then we'll open it up for your questions. Because we have several hundred people participating in the webinar, we'll ask you to comment in the question field or the chat field in your control panel, and we'll take your questions during the final 20 minutes. If time permits, we'll also ask participants to raise their virtual hand, also in the control panel, and then call on you directly. You can tweet about this webinar using the hashtag HealthMatters. And once again, we will be archiving this webinar afterward on Reporting on Health. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Paul Overberg.
Thanks, Michelle. Welcome, everyone. I hope that we can make some progress here today in moving you a little bit farther if you're new to using spreadsheets as a journalist, a little bit farther along the line. I can't make you a master in this short period, but what I can do is give you some tips that have worked for lots and lots of journalists who I've worked with and I've seen others learn about over the years. One of the things that's important when you try to learn to use a spreadsheet, if you're not used to using one, is to figure out a way to get it into your basic workflow and figure out something where you'll use it a little bit every day. One of the things that I suggest to people is that they just start keeping track of some basic personal data, what television shows they watch, their workout schedule, their bylines if they're reporters, and things like that. Mileage on the car and where they've taken trips or telephone calls. Just something so that they're playing with it and working with it all the time. And that way, it's generating a little bit at a time some meaningful personal data that you'll start to see patterns in and you'll start to want to know answers to, and that will sort of pull you in. It'll also give you more and more skill with the basic navigation in Excel. On my screen, you can see that I've got a Microsoft Excel open. There's several versions of spreadsheets. Microsoft Excel for Windows is the most common one. There's a version of it that's not quite as good for the Macintosh. And of course, there's Google Sheets and other versions out there. I'm going to use Excel for Windows partly because that's what most people who use computers use. It's the one I'm most familiar with. But it's worth noting that most of the basic navigation, especially when you're a beginner, most of the basics all work the same in terms of how you navigate and how you set up formulas and enter data and move it around. So with that, let me just say that I want to do a couple basic answers here I'm going to talk about today. One's going to be about why you want to use a spreadsheet as a journalist, and the other one is how. But the why is, as Michelle touched on, is very simple. It lets you dig deeper. It's a little uncomfortable to learn if you're used to writing words or dealing with the other narrative tools of journalism, audio and video, because it takes information and breaks it up into little pieces and then lets you analyze the pieces. And that's really what you have to do. You're analyzing things based on their patterns and relationships. This is a more atomic way of looking at information than most journalists learn in the beginning, and it can be a little discomforting, but it obviously gives you a lot more power to analyze information. And obviously, as journalists, we have to be watching what the government's doing and other people in power, and if they're dealing with spreadsheets, that's obviously one of the things we need to learn too. It's one of those things that it also gives you a lot of flexibility. There's, as I'll show, there's a lot of ways that you can use a spreadsheet. It isn't just for accountants, and this is one of the biggest misconceptions I find when I'm dealing with journalists who are learning this. Spreadsheets obviously are used for financial tracking and analysis, but they are so flexible that journalists and lots of other people use them for all kinds of data capture, cleanup, and analysis. This is also one of the reasons why journalists have to learn spreadsheets a little differently than a lot of people. You can't just open most tutorial and guides for learning spreadsheets if you want to learn as a journalist, because most of those are based on how to keep track of the books or how to do an invoicing system or that sort of thing, the classic financial applications of using a spreadsheet. Journalists, for two reasons, mostly are not analyzing the balance sheet or the monthly cash flows or things like that when they're dealing with spreadsheet data. And two, and this is really critical and very easy to overlook, journalists mostly have to use other people's data. So the data is almost never in the form that they would set it up in. It's almost always dirty. It has assumptions built into it and things like that. And so journalists are often having to learn how to sort of work on other people's data. It's a lot easier if you work in XYZ Corporation and every month the monthly balance sheets and sales reports come out. They're generated by the company. They're designed by the company. They all flow from one place to another in the financial reporting system in ways that everybody can understand. And they keep track of them and keep them clean. Journalists have to sort of go and look at whatever the police department is doing or whatever the campaign contributions are, the way that those are generated by the state agency that does them. Or in this case, as we'll look at, the way that the Centers for Disease Control releases the data. So we have to do a lot of often cleanup and rejiggering and things like that. It's slower, but it basically lets us ask questions and deal with information in the ways that we want to do it and that we have to do it. And finally, one of the things that I want to make a point about is obviously there's more and more data everywhere these days, and so to keep up, you really do need, as a journalist, to be understanding how people are looking at data. And it's not just the government, it's not-for-profit groups, it's neighborhood groups, all kinds of things. This is particularly true in health data. There's been a revolution in the last few years in terms of open health data being available, not just financial data, say all the information that's pouring out of the Obamacare program, but also the actual reporting of data on health conditions and treatments and things like that. The idea of big data is very strong in healthcare and health information, and journalists need to be able to sort of to work their way through that. So let me start by saying this is the why. Now let's talk about the how, very basically. One of the things, here's a basic open spreadsheet in Excel. And one of the things I find that journalists have to get used to, or any beginner when they deal with a spreadsheet, is right away the cursor's different. There's different cursors too. One of the first things that people often say is, where did the cursor go? Well, right now it's there on the screen. It's that black box. And if you use the arrow keys as I'm doing here, with the page up and page down keys, you can see that I'm moving around that black box. And that's basically where the focus is, just like the vertical bar would be in a word processor. You can see that as I move the mouse around, I've got a big fat white cross that actually lets me move the cursor from one place to the other just by clicking. That big fat white cross will change into different types of cursors in different types of situations in Excel, and I'll show that a little bit more later. But the basic idea is we've got rows and we've got columns. One of the things that people first find, one of the things I also find that throws off beginners is that once these columns and rows start to get filled up with information, they sort of overflow sometimes. And this bothers people for some reason. So here I've got information sitting in column A, row 1, it's 1A, but it's flowing over into the B and the C column. And this really bothers people at some point, and they start trying to figure out how to fix this. One of the things that's very simple to do in Excel or in the spreadsheet is to basically define the columns by clicking on the column headers and then just positioning the cursor over any of the dividers between them. You see it generates a double-headed arrow, and when you see that, a double click automatically resizes every column that has information to fit the widest row of information in that column. It's very simple to fix that sort of thing. You can see when I click into that cell where there's actually information that it appears up here in this area. And if I want to actually, once I've created that entry in that cell, if I want to edit it, I click into this bar up here. This is called the formula bar. And this is sort of unlocks the cell and lets me actually do some work in it. You can see that as I'm typing it, it's adding it into the cell, even though I'm actually typing it up in this bar. And all I have to do to get back out of there and lock it down again is to hit the Enter key, which is what I just did. This is really basic stuff, but I want to cover these things because I've seen over the years that people often are off-put by this simple navigational difficulty. One of the things I said is if you start to use an Excel spreadsheet every day, say just entering in your personal data about something, you will quickly get over this hump and you won't have a problem doing this sort of thing. And then you can move on to the next set of challenges. So if you're serious about doing this, that's one of the simplest, easiest ways to do it. Figure out something and do it 5 or 10 minutes a day of data entry, keeping track of something that's meaningful personally. To edit this, I can go back into the address bar and make changes, or I can just go and delete the whole thing by hitting the delete key when the cursor's got it highlighted. All right, let me switch over here. I'm going to show you now in the browser, in the browser that I've opened, a window into a website, the CDC's website. This is a report, typical government report sitting on the Centers for Disease Control website. Here's actually the web page where the CDC has a whole list of mortality tables that it keeps track of, all different kinds of ways to count up death in this country. I want to use deaths because that's sort of a universal, and the CDC keeps a a more robust data portal where you can actually go and pull down data just for one county or one metropolitan area for just a few causes of death or age groups or things like that. I'll show that later in the presentation. This is just a simple look at basic ways CDC presents data. Notice, here's the one that I've actually pulled up on the next screen. Notice that, unfortunately, the CDC presents all these as PDFs. These Adobe documents are nice because they replicate the typography of the published report that's published on paper, but often you can't really do much data work with it. In fact, let me show you what I mean. If I go into this document and try to highlight and cut and paste this information here on the top 15 causes of death into a spreadsheet, I've highlighted it. It shows the causes of death, the numbers of deaths in 2013, the percentage of deaths that each cause represented, and then the rate per 100,000 people. If I copy that and try to paste it into my spreadsheet, watch what happens. Well, that's not good, is it? What it's done is it hasn't preserved that nice table structure. But this is the reason I wanted to use this as an example. We're going to do some numerical analysis a little later, but first we're going to have to clean this up. It would be very nice if the CDC provided this data in a spreadsheet or in a text file that could easily be imported into a spreadsheet. But often governments don't do that sort of thing. So we have to work around it. One of the jokes among data journalists is that we really should be called data janitors because we're often cleaning up data and reformatting it. One of the nice things about this report is that it not only shows the top 15 causes of death for all races and both sexes and all ages, but you can see it's an 82-page report. And right below that, we've got all races, both sexes for children, 1 to 4. And it's got the same sort of thing for 5 to 14-year-olds and on up through the age groups. If all I want is one of these, though, here's what I have to do. You can see the pattern is there, but it's all folded over in a different way. So let me show you some real simple steps where I'm not actually going to be doing analysis of the numbers. I'm just reformatting the data and cleaning it up. First of all, I'm going to insert a column at the top. That's real, just to give myself some working room up at the top. That's just a click on the row number, a right click, and then choosing insert from the pop-up menu. You can see the pattern here. If I widen out column A, everything's sitting in the first column, and each row has been turned into a bunch of what had been a row is now turned into a bunch of information sitting in different rows. What I'd like to do is sort of unfold all that information again. So what I'm going to do is basically tell the spreadsheet to do that. Every formula in Excel starts with the equal sign. So I hit the equal sign and I say to the spreadsheet, what I'd like to do is see that first column of information sitting over here. Just by clicking on the cell, it says, the spreadsheet says, oh, you want to see that cell, and it says, that's A3. You want to see that over here in cell B3. That's pretty simple. If that's what I want, I can just click enter, and you now see that the contents of that one cell are sort of mirrored over here. If I double click on that cell again, you can see that it's still saying equal sign A3, which just means whatever's in cell A3, it will mirror over here in cell B3. What I want to do then is the same thing for the next row. I want to bring the rest of that row back up out of the vertical presentation it's been put into. So I do the same thing and say, bring bring the contents of A4 over and put them in this cell. Oops, sorry. And again, hit enter, and there it is. Same thing with the next one. And I'll do this a little quickly. Okay, and now I'm going to label these columns just so I can keep them straight. You can see a couple of my columns have run over. One quick way to fix that is to click in this cell up here between the A and the 1. That defines the entire worksheet. And then if I double click on any of the column dividers, you can see each one has now been sized exactly the width of the widest one. I'm going to tighten this one down a little. You don't really need to see all of it. Okay, so now that's nice. I've got one set up, don't I? But it would be fairly tedious if I had to do that and type each of these cell contents down here like this for each of the 15 causes. I'd have to go and type this like that, and I'd have to type this like that, and so on. And on and on and on. But I don't have to do that. The real benefit of this, using this tool, is what's called this relative referencing system. So over here, say, for instance, what's really going on in this formula here is in cell C3, it's going to reflect whatever is sitting in cell A4 as I've designated. But what it's really doing is it's saying it's looking 2 columns over to the left and 1 row down. It doesn't really matter that those particular cells are there, because if I take this information here and copy it, I should be able to make it work for other places. So let's try that. I'm going to copy those formulas and put them down here so that they should be able to capture this same pattern that's taking this information and spreading it out this way. Should be able to do the same thing for this information here and spread it out this way. So I've highlighted these cells. Let me go back a sec. I've highlighted those cells by clicking and dragging through them with the mouse. They're ready to go. Control C, just like in any word processor, copies. It says, get ready to copy this information somewhere. It puts it on the clipboard. And what I wanted to do is to basically do the same thing that it's doing, but do it down here. So I position the cursor down there by clicking the mouse there. And now I'm going to use paste, or Control V if you use keyboard shortcuts. And look what just happened. What's really happened is, for instance, this cell is a good example. Up here it said A7, but what it really was saying was go 5 columns over and 4 columns down and copy that information. So when I copied it down to here, it's doing now the exact same thing. 5 columns over and 4 columns down. I can now do this the same way for each of these rows. And I can basically rebuild the table very quickly here, just by copying and pasting Now, obviously, this would be fairly tedious if I had 500 rows. For that, you need to learn other tricks. But today, it's important just to understand that this is possible in principle. In a sense, what we're doing here is we're taking we've understood the pattern, we're using it to basically program a solution. That's what this simple trick is doing here. And these is the rudiments of how you think about sort of treating information in industrial fashion and manufacturing solutions. Reformatting it. Okay, so now I've got it all set up exactly the way I want. It's all still scattered out, but I can use another feature of Excel to take care of that. First of all, let me put a boldface on the headers so that they're more distinguishable. And now what I want to do is get rid of all these blank so that I can see just the stuff itself. Okay. So let me make sure that I've got it all defined. So I could define it by dragging it with the mouse. That might be a little tedious if I've got several screens of information. There's a shortcut trick. Holding down Shift and using arrow keys to do that. For this much information, that's not hard at all. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to make sure I've defined all the information for the next trick that I'm going to do. Up on the Data menu, Data tab, the ribbon opens, and it shows a tool called Filtering. Notice what it's just done when I've chosen it. It puts a little drop down next to each column header. This is one reason why we always want to make sure that we have column headers filled in when we've got a nice clean grid of information in Excel. Because that opens up all kinds of functionality. If I click now on any of these column headers, I can see that all the values of associate in that column are available for selection or deselection. And so are some of these other tools to sift and sort this information. So what I want to do, if I want to just see the rows that have information, is I want to say pick this one and uncheck the one that says blanks. There. Now I've got it all showing again. So right away, just this quickly, you can see that we haven't done any analysis yet, but we've taken a fairly messy pile of data that we got the way the government agency wants to give it to us. We don't have to get on the phone and beg and plead for getting it in some other form. We can clean it up ourselves, and we can now go and do something with this information fairly quickly. I've just highlighted it again just by clicking and dragging through it. Hitting Control-C, you can see that it's the marching ants pattern that shows the highlighting. Is trying to signal that there's information sort of tucked in accordion pleats behind the scenes here when the filter is on. What I'm going to do is create a new worksheet. There are multiple tabs down here. You can see that I'm working in one called Sheet 1. Every Excel file has, and any other spreadsheet file, has the capability of doing this, where you can just keep adding worksheets, just like sheets in a notebook. There. Now I've got the information all set. And extracted cleanly. I mentioned before that over in the original report that we were seeing, there's other age groups, for instance, that we might want to get the same information for. And let me just show you how the formulas that I've generated back here in Excel would help us if we wanted to go and do that. I'll take the filter off. You can see everything is all there, is out there again. If I was to go back to this report and just take the same grid of information that's there for children, ages 1 to 4, and copy and paste that, putting it into Excel again, you'll see that it drops it down into that same pattern. But now what I can do is I can just reuse some of the work I've already done, for instance, and reformat it even faster the second time. I'm going to tighten up some of these columns, make it easier to look at what we're looking at here. Oh, that's a good example right on screen of something that throws beginners, and I always reassure them. Anytime you tighten the column's width down below the point where its contents can show, you see those hashtags or number sign, pound signs. All you have to do to change that back is widen it again. But anyway, what I've done here is I've brought over the column headers that I had set up for the first round into the second round. And now what I can do is the same thing here, just by copying, remember, the original formula set that I'd used, where I was pulling the information out of a set of rows and over into one row stretched across several columns. Again, because the relative referencing system, if I copy that information over to here, it will now work for the new data that I've just dropped in. In fact, I'll show you. If I want to capture those rows and reformat everything for the children's causes of death, all I need to do is move my cursor to the lower right corner of the highlighted cells. These cells now have formulas in them, you can see. So if I want to copy those formulas down, if I highlight those cells, double-click on this black cross that the cursor turns into, immediately you can see that I've done that. Now I only want to see some of those, but I'll back up here and do it the way I did the last time. You can see that there it is. It's starting to come in the same way. And if I go, oops, I've lost my copy. All I need to do is start it up again.
Paul, this is Michelle. Can you type in the URL? A few people want to try and follow along, find this
Okay.
data sheet.
Sure. Hold on. Okay, so this PDF, let me put it in Excel and blow it up so everybody can see it.
I think they just want to have that link of that. If you put it in the chat box,
Okay.
and to all, everyone can see it.
Okay.
And then they can click on it.
Got it. Let me re-expand there. Okay. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. So let me just finish copying these down and I'll show you the result. Okay, so I've basically transformed the infant's data, the way I did the total data. Now I've got them sitting next to each other, and again, if I just look at just the non-blank cells, I've now got the totals right next to each other, and I can compare the rates and the totals for children versus everybody. And here's where you can actually do for a quick analysis. Sometimes all you need is a fact for a story or a quick double check on something. You can work right on screen as a calculator. I don't need to set up a formula. Let's say I just want to look at in the overall data, let's say I want to add up what percentage of the deaths are caused by the top 3 causes. Well, if I just click and highlight those 3 cells, the percentage of the total for the diseases of the heart, cancer, and chronic lower respiratory diseases, you can see that down here on the status bar it tells me I've got 3 cells highlighted. That's 51.7% of the deaths right there. Half the deaths in this country are in the top 3 causes. But among children, it's 3 different causes, obviously, and it's 52% of the deaths. We could do it even in a scattered fashion. If I picked something like what percentage of the deaths in this country are due to accidents, Alzheimer's, and diabetes combined, you can see that I've got 11% of the deaths. So this will let you do that kind of work just on screen. Or what's the total number of deaths for these 3 causes? Again, it sums it up right down here. So a lot of times you can do pretty quick analysis right on the screen. You don't even have to set up formulas and things like that. Now, okay, this was basically what I wanted to cover. There was a couple more things that I could add on, if Michelle, if we'd like, or we could cut over to questions. One thing that I was going to show very quickly is that if all we had done in this separate worksheet, if we had only gotten the total numbers from whoever our source was, we could easily figure out the percentages and the total if we know the total number of deaths and, of course, the population denominator. And we could even reverse engineer that out of the total. But if you'd like, we could cut over and we could just work on questions now. And I could show that if anybody's interested.
Paul, did you want to show some simple formulas and addition and so on as well, or do you feel like you
Right.
want to move to questions?
Sure. Let me show that very quickly. The basics of doing formulas in Excel is very simple. It just extends that idea of using the equal sign and using basic notation with cell addresses. So let me show here, for instance, the percentage of total deaths. We would say equals that number divided by, obviously, the total. And in that case, you get 100%. Now I'm going to, oops. I'm going to put dollar signs in front of the total as in the denominator, because now I can just double click on this, again, this little cross that the cursor turns into when it's on that lower right corner. Oops. Didn't lock it in. Now I'll do it. There. You can see that Excel has adjusted so that it now says, okay, Alzheimer's disease, 84,767 deaths divided by the total number of deaths. And it's referencing the number in the top row, and that gives us 3% of all deaths, just like diabetes, things like that. If we wanted to do a simple addition, we would just say equals this. Let's say we wanted to add up 3 in a row. We just use the notation, and you can see Excel is volunteering to help here. I could say, if I wanted to add up those, there you go. Use a colon between the two cell addresses, and it'll add up everything in between. If you wanted to add one more, just type a comma, click on it, and it will sum up those 5 plus the 6th one. And then just close the parentheses, and there it is. So this is why it's really helpful if you start putting some personal data together in a spreadsheet. You not only learn the navigation, but you'll quickly start asking questions about it. And these simple formulas are ways to get those answers. And you can see Excel is even ready to help out. If you wanted to do a subtraction, you would just say this minus this. Okay?
So, Paul, should we turn to a few questions at this point?
Absolutely. If there's questions, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, so this one is from Lisa Alafiris at KQED. She says, I'm interested in seeing bigger data sets, and she wants to copy and paste part of it to a blank sheet while retaining headers, and she wants to know how to retain the headers.
Okay. Bigger data sets. Well, there are ways, I mean, obviously, the example I chose here had a small number of rows to make it easy to cut and paste. There are ways to take apart a great big PDF of hundreds of pages if it's formatted in a standard way. There's tools to do that with, and not really easily done in cut and paste. But one of the things you can do, it depends on where you're getting the information that you're cutting and pasting from. If it's in a table, on one of those web pages that has borders around cells and that are in a regular grid of information, let me just show you a trick that a lot of people use. We do this more often. There's a Firefox add-on. That's one reason I use Firefox, called Table Tools 2. there, and just put it in. So for instance, if you then go to a web page, see if I can find a quick one as a good example on the CDC's website. Most of the CDC's data is not set up that way, but you can cut and paste just by defining the table itself and then right-clicking. And if you're trying to preserve headers, sometimes that works. It depends on how complicated they are, and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, you can see that the headers are mostly simple, but they are 2 columns or 2 rows in some cases. Sometimes you just end up having to retype these things. And it makes sense to do that if you need to simplify and clarify your headers anyway. If you're going to be analyzing the data and coming back to it a week later and say, what was that? Was that a rate per 100,000? Or was that a rate per million or a rate per 10,000? Having a header that says rate doesn't work, like in this case. It's also really important when you're working with other people and you're on-passing your data to a colleague. The column headers should be very clear and plain so that there's no confusion, especially on deadline. So sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Hope that helps answer the question.
So I have another question from Don Sapatkin, and he asks, can you explain what that $sign did?
Yes, good question. That's called anchoring a formula. Essentially, what happens, as you saw, let me go back to that point. I'm going to back up and delete that information. So here's, if I just said B2, if I just said, okay, I want to know, oops, sorry. All right, so if I just said, I want to know, obviously I've got the total number of deaths here, I divide it by the total to get 100%. If I then tried to copy this down, you can see that I get, basically Excel does exactly that. It says, okay, you want me to take the cell over here to the left and divide it by itself. That just gives you 100% or 1. What I really want to do is I want to divide each of these numbers by the total so that we get the percent. Now, if I wanted to do that by hand, I would have to type equals and then take that and then type B2 for every one of these rows. Equals this divided by B2. That would get pretty tedious. And I've only got 15 rows. The trick of anchoring means that I'm telling Excel, take the cell that's one cell over to the left and divide it by this particular cell, just this particular cell. Don't slide the reference, the second reference. Lock it down and keep it focused there. That means that each of these subtotals here of diseases is going to be divided by the total number of deaths. That way, when I go and use this handy copy down feature, I immediately get, as you can see in the example down here, I get each row divided by that first cell, which is the total. That's how I get the percentages. Anytime you want to anchor a cell reference, you use a $sign in front of it. You can anchor just the row reference, which is the number, or just the column reference, and sometimes there's reasons for doing one or the other. But most often what we do is this sort of thing, where we lock the entire reference down by putting in the $sign in front of the row and the column reference. So you get this kind of thing. That lets you take advantage of all these, of the copy down feature, which is so handy. Is there another question?
Yes, we have a number of them. I have a question from Gurjeet Singh, who says, was that a keyboard shortcut you used to apply the formula in all the cells for the percentage of total? I didn't see the cursor being dragged down, but I think you kind of answered that. It's the clicking on the little corner
Yes.
where it turns into a
Absolutely.
cross.
If you watch that cursor, we call this the big fat white cross. And actually, if I were to use this fat white cross, as we call it, the cursor now, and do this, all I'd be doing is copying. I wouldn't be copying anything. But if I move it, this little, it's hard to see maybe, but let's do this. We'll zoom in. There. That little square on the lower right corner of the cell where the cursor is sitting is called the fill handle often. And you see the cursor changes to a black cross when it's highlighted. At that point, you can pull with the mouse down, you can copy down manually, or you can just double click. Double clicking works as long as there's something to the left, and that's the key issue. It'll only work as long as there's data to the left, in this case, this information here, for Excel to basically logically extend the formula that you've highlighted there. Let me zoom back down. So that's the trick. Okay, next question?
Yeah, I have a number of folks asking, is there like a Excel for Dummies book or something? And I referenced the links that you provided on reporting on health on this Excel webinar page, but is there an additional resource that you would want to share with people if they want to dive deeper?
The importance with this is to find the way that you learn. And one of the tricks about being a journalist or anything these days, when there's everything out there on the web, is to understand your learning style. The handouts that I've included that Michelle put on the web page are done by journalists for journalists, and they sort of focus on data the way journalists typically look at it and the way journalists think. If any of those don't work for you, and you're more a visual learner, there are videos out there, obviously. And just go to YouTube and Google Excel tutorial. If you Google Excel tutorial, you'll find a ton of Excel sites where people go into really detailed lessons for beginners and for advanced people as well. So I would find the way it learned. If you learn best from a book, go get Excel for Dummies. That's a good way to do it. If you learn best from video, go to YouTube. These handouts, like I mentioned, though, are good places to start. They're sort of battle tested by hundreds of journalists. So if you're trying to do this as a journalist, they may be the best place to start.
Thanks, Paul. And I have a question here. Somebody says, I have an Excel spreadsheet with 1 million rows and columns of info. I want to extract, say, 50 rows of data across all columns. How do I copy and paste along with headers?
Okay, so this person wants to take 50 rows out of 1 million? Is that what it sounds like?
I think she's speaking a little bit, it's not necessarily 1 million, but a ton. There's a ton of rows and columns. She only wants 50, but she wants to preserve the headers.
Okay, so let me just try to work through on the screen a couple possibilities here. Let's say we've got not just 15 rows here, but thousands of them. I put the filter back on here, and I could say, for instance, it depends on how she's trying to select them. But these are 50 rows that are scattered through hundreds and hundreds of them, and she just wants to isolate and expose those 50 rows for copying. Then she could do it very quickly with a filtering trick. So let's say she says, I want just cells that contain, I'm just going to type a nonsense sequence here. There. Okay. I just picked a 2-letter text sequence to isolate just 4 of the 15 rows. Now I could copy and paste those, and there's a special trick here I'll show you. I just copy them, go to a new worksheet. If they're filtered like that, it'll just paste down, and if I've highlighted the column headers, that will preserve them. Hopefully that's what she's looking for. You just have to include the column headers in the pasting that you're doing. Is there another question?
Yes. Can you explain the difference between using filter and sort? Also,
Sure.
under what circumstances is it better to filter rather than sort data?
Well, obviously, let's just do this real quick. If I put the filter on, like I've just done, and you click on one of the drop-downs, you can see that sorting is an option built into that. But if I don't have the filter on and I just want to sort, you can see that I don't have the other filtering options that are available. Well, anytime I've got data like this highlighted, and this is again why I want to keep a clean grid of data, I call it. Only one row in the header, and always a blank row. If I'm going to put totals down here, I'm going to separate it by a row of blank space so they don't get swept in any sort. The same thing over here. Just back up a second here. Okay, so if I highlight the data and then right-click, sort is also an option there as well. But filtering has a lot more possibilities, because I can then say, just give me a range of numbers in this column. I can say, just show me the top 10. And I can do compound filtering too. So I can say, show me just these 3 diseases. And then I can filter here for just these, for just this one, for instance. So filtering, you can see that anytime a filter is set on a column, there's a little triangle. The drop-down has a slightly different look. It's not this triangle. It actually shows the funnel or the filter that's set there. And if you hover your mouse on the filter, it'll actually show you what the filter is that's set there. You can turn all these off just by turning it off. So filtering basically gives you a lot more functionality than sorting does. Another question?
You know, Paul, I think that we've run out of time here, but I can have one other question that you can answer for those who can stay. But I just wanted to remind everybody that we are going to be archiving this webinar, and you can review it. And there's a host of really excellent resources that Paul has put together on that Excel webinar page on reporting on health. I also wanted to remind you of 2 other things. We're going to be sending you a short survey, and if you could please provide feedback. This is really the first of our craft webinars as opposed to something more on healthcare policy, so we'll be very interested in your feedback, and it just takes a few minutes. And to remind you that this will be paired, this webinar, with another one, July 23rd, focus on data visualization, so I encourage you to sign up if you found this one to be helpful. So, folks, you know, we're just going to, there's a few more questions here, but, you know, for all intents and purposes, you know, you can stick around or not, but thank you very much for joining us. So, Paul, I'm going to, if you have a few more minutes, there's just a couple questions left here. One is from Cheryl Clark, who says, I analyze CMS quality data, which has tens of thousands of rows and dozens of columns. It's kind of similar to the earlier question. I want to select a range without dragging through it all. How do I do that in Excel for Mac 2011?
Okay, let me show you a couple of quick tricks with the keyboard that should work even in the Mac. If I want to highlight all this stuff, this let's imagine that I've got several thousand rows here instead of 15. If I hold down park my cursor up in the upper left corner, and I'm holding down the Shift key, if I use the arrow keys on my keyboard, I can highlight all the columns of information. And then, still with the Shift key down, I think this one will work on the Mac. If I hit the End key and the down arrow key, and then release it, and then hit down arrow, watch what happens. It highlights everything. That would work for 50,000 rows as well as 15. So again, that's Shift key down, hit the End key and the right arrow key, and then the End key, and then the down arrow key. Again, a clean grid of information makes that a lot easier. I hope that helps. I think that one works on the Macintosh keyboard. One of the functionality is a little different on the Mac, but even if it's not, I think you can program that into the Mac keyboard so that it works in Excel. I hope that helps. Yeah.
And if you have time, Paul, we have one person, Jason Bodian, who was wondering if you could quickly show again how to paste the material from the PDF into Excel. He says
Sure.
he's ending everything in one long column.
It depends on how the information is actually structured in the PDF, how it's actually going to come in when you do this sort of thing. And you could, sometimes it's useful to bounce it off a word processor, cut and paste into a word processor first. It depends on how it's set up again, how it'll come in. But let me show you again. If I highlight these rows and then copy, I'll start on a blank spreadsheet. Here's the paste, and then everything comes in like that. It doesn't always happen that way out of a PDF. Like I said, it depends on the PDF structure. I use this one as an example of something where it all comes in fairly cleanly, but just rearranged, and it's simple to use Excel's basic functionality to fix it up. So if it's all coming in, he said it's all coming in as one long column. Is that what he said, Michelle?
I'm sorry, I was muted. He says, I'm ending up with everything in one long column. That's correct. And then another person just says, mine also pastes, but this person says all in one row from the same file. Perhaps it's an issue of the Excel version. Oh, I'm sorry. The original person, Jason, wrote back and said one long row. So it seems like it's a row, a column that it's showing up in.
Okay. So if it's coming in as one long row, then in this case, he would just have to do the same thing I did, only reversing it, reversing the process, basically reconstructing by relative references the structure of the table so that one long row of stuff would then come in a nice grid like you would want. So sometimes one of the things about Excel is it will take that, it will fix that problem just as easily as it fixed the problem that I had with this PDF. It's because it is that flexible. You just have to set it up. This is what I mean about sort of an atomic view of information. You're breaking all these little pieces, hundreds and hundreds and sometimes thousands and tens of thousands of them. It can handle that, and it can move them around and rearrange them in all kinds of ways. There's no end of possibilities. You just have to sort of master the basic functionality. Was there another question?
One more question, Paul, from Cynthia Kraft in Sacramento. She asks if you could talk a little bit about cleaning the data. And then she says it seems such a subjective process which gives the journalist pause.
Well, let's call it editing the data then. The journalists are always about editing things. They know they have to edit their notes. They know they have to edit their quotes. They have to edit their work, their drafts, etc. Let's just take this example. When I got to clean this up as an example. Get rid of the kids here for a minute. or let's go back over here. This is medical speak or doctor speak, these causes. And you can see they even have the International Classification for Disease Codes here that they're sort of adding in there. Let's say we wanted to create a new categorization of diseases. It wouldn't be that hard to do that. We could just insert a column, call it something. And in this case, it would be pretty easy to say, let's say we focus on diseases of old age or aging. See how once I've typed aging into the column once, Excel is ready to volunteer that. The next time I hit A, and let's say there. It can be arbitrary, but it's one of those things where journalists are exerting judgment all the time in the way that they sift and sort and analyze stuff. So it's essentially part of our mission to help clarify, help people understand information and make sense of it. It's one of those things that we do all the time. This way, one of the nice things about Excel is it's very explicit and very standard here. And somebody else could come in and say, no, I don't want to call these diseases of aging. I'll change it to something else. I want a different coding. And I'll say that these are some other kind of information. That sort of thing. So again, it can be, but obviously one of the things I tell people is you have to approach the data with a pure heart, which gets a laugh sometimes. But the point is that if you want to, one of the ways that advocacy groups spin information is they use data and they interpret it the way they want to. One of the reasons journalists have to be able to understand data is so that they can sniff out that spin and give people an honest look at, a more honest look sometimes than the advocacy groups will, especially in medicine, about what's really going on. And if we approach the data with a pure heart, we don't have our thumb on the scale, we're not trying to prove something here, we can help the public understand things that sometimes will help cut through all the spin that the advocacy groups are putting on the data about whether it's sign-ups under Obamacare or funding for various cancer causes or things like that. Okay. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Colin. I love your idea of approaching the data with a pure heart. That's really appealing and a different way of framing it. And thank you for this really clear and helpful webinar. And just a reminder to everybody that this is going to be archived on Reporting on Health and that there's some excellent resources there. And we're going to have a follow-up webinar on July 23rd on data visualization with Becca Aronson of the Texas Tribune. Please fill out our survey. Thank you all so much and have a great day.